Hi everybody! I'm Katherine and welcome back to my channel. Today's video is all about how I created this 1950s maternity shirt dress. It has a very full pleated skirt which goes just to the knee, a fitted bodice, fitted 3/4 length sleeves, and a collar and lapels. It also has some maternity-friendly alterations that were made to the pattern from how I would usually make a dress like this. And if you are pregnant and looking to make a maternity dress, then definitely stick around till the end of the video where I talk about all those tips. Now, the inspiration for this dress came from a lovely lady who's here on YouTube, and she also sells patterns and has a blog. Her company is called Sense and Sensibility Patterns. I will link the website below. And I saw a photo of a dress that she made, very similar to this, and it was on a blog post all about vintage maternity dresses that she's made. And this was a dress that she'd altered from her standard pattern for a 1950s shirt dress. And so I just loved that dress so much that I decided I had to make one just like it, and I'm really happy with how it turned out. If you would like to see the entire process from start to finish, as well as hearing my tips on creating and designing maternity dresses for yourself, then just keep on watching. Okay, so here I'm just figuring out my bodice pattern. You can see the waist is much higher in the front than in the back, and I'm just figuring out how much lower I want it to be in the back. And I'm just drawing on that line. And here are all my pattern pieces cut out and ready to go. There's the bodice, the sleeve, the cuff, and the collar, and the skirt piece underneath. Okay, so here's my technique for sewing darts. This is the waist dart for the bodice. I first hand basted it in this way by kind of doing like a laddering stitch across the legs of the dart. It takes a little extra time, but it makes the dart sewing just so much more smooth. And then you just pull the two ends of the thread, and then it forms your dart, and then there's that nice basted line for you to sew along with your machine. And when I sew a dart, I decrease the size of my stitches the closer I get to the tip of the dart. And then for the last inch or so of the dart, I turn the needle in and just sew right along that folded edge for the last inch or so with really tiny stitches. And it makes a pretty smooth result. And so I'm just sewing up some of the seams in the bodice, like the side seams and the shoulder seams. And as usual, I did use French seams for this project. Okay, so there's the bodice sewn up with its French seams. And here are the sleeves. I just attached the cuffs to the bottom of the sleeves. And I just folded up that bottom edge of the cuff, and now I'm going to sew along to connect the two sides of the sleeve together. And here's my big skirt panels. So I'm just gonna sew up those side seams with a French seam as well. And there's the finished product of that. Okay, so here are my collar pieces. There are the two outer pieces with another layer sandwiched in between just to add some strength instead of interfacing. And so I sewed along just the bottom edge of the collar, and now I'm grading the seam allowance. So I'm only trimming down one of the layers. so it won't be quite such a bulky line once it's turned right side out. And I snipped that seam allowance, turned it, and top stitched it around the edge. Here I'm just working on the sleeves now. I've got them sewn in as well with French seams. And now I'm going to attach the collar. But first I have to turn inward the center front, just built-in facing for the buttons. Okay, so there's the collar. I've pinned it on, and you can see I only pinned on the inside under layer of the collar, because the way that I will finish this edge is by hand stitching down the topmost part of the collar like that over the seam allowance. I'm just kind of trimming down those edges. Okay, and yes, I'm sorry, it's a bit off camera here, but I'm just hand stitching down now the topmost part of the collar so that it covers up the seam allowance from the collar seam. Now in hindsight, if I were to do this project again, I would have just had a full built-in facing, and the facing can also have the same function of hiding the collar seam. And there we go. So I've hand stitched down the center front facing as well. And now I'm just tacking at the bottom where those two edges will be overlapped so that it's easier to attach the bodice to the skirt accurately. And I'm planning the placement of the buttons. I just like to do this by eye. I never mark it on my patterns. So just putting a line where each buttonhole is going to be. Okay, and then the way I do this is I just snip across that line and then I test it to make sure the button will be able to fit through before I sew the buttonhole. And I always like to hand stitch my buttonholes. I'm not the neatest buttonhole stitcher. And actually this particular buttonhole turned out a lot messier than it should have because I used double thread and the thread was already quite thick. So I actually ended up redoing this buttonhole later, as you'll see. I do have a more modern machine that does buttonholes, but it's not too reliable with that. So I just prefer to hand stitch it. Yeah, so it's pretty bulky, not the nicest buttonhole. They're all three done. I did the next two with only a single thread, and I wasn't happy with how the first one looked, so I actually cut out those stitches and redid it with a single thread as well. There we go, and now I'm just marking where to sew on my actual buttons. Sorry, it's a bit off camera. I like to use a thick needle or a toothpick at the bottom to hold my stitches a bit looser, and then I do a buttonhole stitch around them on the underside. And there are the buttons all done. And I just wanted to show just how wide the skirt panel is compared to the bodice, because I did want it to have a very full skirt. And so this is attempt number 1 at getting it pleated down. I wasn't really satisfied with how it came out though. I was just looking at the inspiration photo and her pleats looked so much more like just flat and neat. So I decided to redo them. And at this point I realized that part of my problem was I needed an extra layer in the skirt. So I decided to dip into my stash of cotton organdy, which is a very stiff, papery fabric, and make a built-in petticoat for this dress. And I actually used more yardage in this petticoat than I did in the outer skirt itself. So I just pleated it down more so it would fit the bodice. And there it's all pleated, and I basted those pleats in place. And now I redid the pleats on the outer skirt. I made them a little bit wider this time. And basted them in place. Okay, so now I'm just pinning on both the outer skirt and the inner skirt at the same time to the bodice. This was definitely a very bulky seam to maneuver, as you can imagine, with all that pleated fabric. Okay, so I sewed that seam, and this actually took a long time because I realized that I didn't like how much lower the back waistline was. It looked kind of funny, so I ended up re-sewing that a few times to take up the extra length that I didn't want in the back bodice. And so I have a lot of bulky seam allowance to trim down. And I used this straight grain tape that I just ironed. I used cotton muslin, and I'm using that to finish the seam allowance on the waist. And so not only will it hide those raw edges, but it's also going to help stabilize this seam because there's so much weight in the skirt and the bodice was fairly flimsy. So I first sewed the tape to the seam allowance first, and then I went in and I hand stitched down that top edge to the bodice itself. And finally, I'm working on the hem. This took a long time. I only pinned and sewed the hem to the inner skirt so the stitches wouldn't show through to the front. I did have to pleat those edges, as you can see, so it would lie flat. And it took a long time just to get it in the right place, but I succeeded eventually.
Hi everyone! So I finished my 1950s inspired maternity dress, and here's the finished product with a full body shot. You can see the really poofy short skirt, which I absolutely adore. I've always wanted a dress with a short poofy skirt like this and fitted on top. And I'm really happy with how it turned out, especially considering I didn't make a mock-up. I really like how the upper body turned out. The collar is actually a little different than the picture I was going from, but I turned out liking this style a little more anyways. And I'll just show you the back. Okay, so at this point I'll go into talking about just little things that happen throughout the making process, and then I'll jump right into the maternity dress tips for any of you who are pregnant and looking to design or sew yourself a maternity dress. Okay, so I just wanted to note that I am really happy with how it turned out. It turned out very close to my inspiration photo. The only things that were different were the collar. My collar came out a little differently, but I actually prefer the look of this collar to her original collar anyways, so I'm happy with that. For me anyways, I like it better. And the sleeves, they're actually supposed to have a full cuff that's rolled up, but number one, I like the look of the longer sleeves, and number two, these sleeves are quite fitted, and I find if I roll up the cuff, it's just a little too tight at the bottom there. Okay, so let's get into maternity dress tips. For the sake of these tips, I'm going to assume that you already have some previous sewing knowledge or previous sewing patterns from when you weren't pregnant. Or at the very least, if you're just starting to sew when you're pregnant, you should just have a rough understanding of dress design and darts and things like that, which it's not too complicated. Okay, so with this dress, the main thing is that when you're pregnant, your waistline not only increases in girth, but it also changes height on your body. It moves from being down here and being the same level all around to coming up higher in the front and lower in the back. And the further along in your pregnancy you are, the higher your waistline will be at the top. So the main thing is that you need to shift the waistline of your dress pattern higher, and especially make it a little bit higher in the front than it is in the back. So you'll need to just make a gently curved line connecting the front bodice waistline to the back bodice waistline. Another thing that's important is that when you're pregnant, if you want a dress that's going to fit you throughout your pregnancy, you need to make sure you have some extra room. So with this dress, for instance, I used my same bodice block that I would usually use, but I simply sewed narrower darts than what I would normally sew, giving me some extra room in the upper body. So I am quite confident that this dress will fit me till the end of my pregnancy. And the way you work with that extra room right now, because I'm like 5 months along right now, is I really like this waist belt because it takes in whatever is extra, and I kind of push the extra to the back, as you can see. That's why it's a bit wrinkled up. But what that does is it just makes the skirt poof out that much more at the back, which is nice on this style of dress. So I hope those tips helped, and I hope you guys enjoyed this video, whether you're pregnant or not. And if you like this video, give it a like, leave your comments below, and consider subscribing to my channel for more awesome sewing content like this. Thanks for watching, guys. Bye.